3 a.m. The parking lot was empty, save for the rhythmic flicker of the emergency room lights against the asphalt. Emily stood by her car, her grip on the metal keyring so tight that her knuckles turned stark white. A few yards away, the hospital doors groaned shut, sealing in the smell of antiseptic and the sound of monitors. Inside her bag, the pager let out a sharp, insistent buzz. It was the sound of a command she had obeyed for thousands of hours. She did not reach for it. She did not turn back to the glass doors. Instead, she popped the lock, grabbed the pile of medical scrubs from the passenger seat, and tossed them into the footwell. She climbed in, started the engine, and backed out of the space. As she reached the exit gate, she didn't look in the rearview mirror. The hospital lights faded into a single, receding glow in the dark. For the first time in her adult life, the shift was over, and the pager remained silent. She turned onto the main road and drove into the night, leaving the title behind. The road ahead opened up, but her mind drifted backward to the stage where it all began. Years prior, she had walked across the platform, head held high, believing the diploma in her hand was a key to a wider world. She had traded the entirety of her 20s for stacks of textbooks and replaced sleep with endless, repetitive hospital rotations. She had believed the finish line was defined by a high salary and the authority of her position. It was a lie she told herself to justify the mounting mountain of student debt. Each month, the interest compounded, anchoring her to the institution even as she climbed the ranks. The prestige she once chased now felt like a lead weight pressing against her chest. She had thought the long hours were an investment in a future of her own design, but the math never added up. The more she advanced, the less time she possessed. The ambition that once fueled her had slowly calcified into a rigid, inescapable routine. She had built a life on the promise of future reward, only to realize that the reward was a cage, and the bars were made of her own persistent, exhausting labor. The breaking point did not arrive with a scream, but with the rhythmic, mechanical blinking of a cursor on a monitor. Emily sat at the workstation, the blue glare of the screen washing out the room. Her task was simple: update the patient charts, process the intake, repeat. She stared at the rows of data, but the letters blurred into meaningless shapes. Her hands, usually precise enough to navigate the most delicate procedures, began to tremor. She pressed her palms against the cold metal of the desk to steady them, but the shaking persisted. It was the third week of back-to-back night rotations. She tried to recall the last time she had stood in her own living room while the sun was still visible through the window. She could not. Every memory was filtered through the sterile, artificial lighting of the hospital. She looked down at her own reflection in the darkened glass of the terminal. She saw a stranger, a ghost, drifting through a life that belonged to someone else. The realization settled into her bones with the weight of lead. She was not living. She was merely surviving within the walls of a cycle that had no end. The data on the screen kept scrolling, demanding attention she no longer had to give. That evening, the silence of her apartment felt heavy. She pulled a worn book from the shelf, its spine cracked from years of neglect. She opened it to a marked page. The words stared back at her. Success should bring greater freedom, not greater captivity. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had been trading her hours for a paycheck that barely covered the cost of maintaining her high-stress existence. She stood up, paced the small room, and looked at the ledger of her own debts. The cycle was broken only by a change in strategy. She did not sleep that night. Before the sun rose, she sat at her computer and navigated to a financial platform. She typed in her information, verified her identity, and opened a brokerage account. It was a simple digital act, but it felt like cutting a tether. She was no longer just a provider of medical care. She was now an architect of her own exit. She moved the first of her savings into the account, watching the balance update on the screen. The number was small, but it was the first brick in a wall she was building to protect her future. She closed the laptop, finally felt the tension in her shoulders loosen, and waited for the day to begin. The hospital cafeteria became her classroom. While others gossiped over lukewarm coffee, Emily sat in the corner, a tablet propped against a stack of charts. She studied the strategies of Warren Buffett, dissecting the mechanics of compound interest between rounds of patient vitals. She treated her brokerage account with the same clinical precision she applied to a surgical procedure. Every paycheck arrived, and before a single cent could be drained by lifestyle inflation, she transferred the bulk of it into index funds. She stopped looking at store windows. She stopped browsing for upgrades to her home. Her gaze shifted exclusively to dividend yields and asset growth. She viewed every dollar not as currency, but as a soldier she was sending into the field to work on her behalf. Her colleagues noticed the change. They saw her refusing overtime shifts, declining expensive group dinners, and keeping her eyes fixed on the numbers whenever she had a spare moment. She was no longer just a doctor, she was a silent collector of her own future time. Every deposit was a day she would eventually reclaim. Every successful trade was a step further away from the fluorescent lights and the endless, draining rotation of the ward. She was buying her own life back, one asset at a time. Years blurred into a cycle of relentless double shifts. The hospital became a claustrophobic maze of flickering lights and constant, sterile alarms. Emily moved through the corridors, her pulse synchronized to the rhythm of the ward, while her digital portfolio grew quietly in the background. Every morning, she checked her account status before stepping onto the floor. The numbers climbed, yet the physical weight of the building felt heavier with every passing month. She performed her rounds with mechanical accuracy, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating the exact date of her potential exit. A crisis in the emergency room forced her to stay an extra 4 hours, the fluorescent glare stinging her eyes. She stood over a patient, the monitors screaming in the silence, and for a fleeting second, her phone vibrated in her pocket with a dividend notification. The duality was agonizing. She was a high-performing professional in the eyes of her peers, but inside, she was a prisoner planning a silent escape. The walls of the ward seemed to press against her chest, tight and unforgiving. She looked at the exit signs and the endless stream of incoming charts, feeling the suffocating pressure of a life she was no longer willing to lead. She kept her secret, she kept her posture, and she kept her eyes on the mounting, invisible exit door. 5 years had passed. Emily sat in the quiet of her office, the hum of the hospital ventilation providing a constant, low-frequency drone. A knock rattled the door. A junior doctor stepped inside, his skin sallow, his hands trembling as he gripped a stack of patient files. He sank into the chair opposite her, his eyes hollowed by lack of sleep. "How do you keep going?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Every shift feels like the last day of my life." Emily did not offer him a platitude about resilience or duty. Instead, she reached out and turned her monitor toward him. The screen displayed a complex, color-coded spreadsheet of passive income streams, dividends, and asset growth. The junior doctor stared, his mouth slightly open, his focus shifting from the medical charts to the rows of mounting capital. "I stopped chasing more," Emily said, her voice steady and devoid of the exhaustion he projected. "I stopped seeking the next promotion or the validation of the hierarchy. I started chasing the ability to say no." She watched the realization settle over him, the silent realization that the walls he feared were only as tall as his own willingness to remain trapped. She had laid her map of freedom on the table, and for the first time, the junior doctor stopped looking at the floor. Emily stood up. The chair clicked against the linoleum, a sharp sound that seemed to echo through the entire wing. She did not look back at the junior doctor, who remained anchored to his seat, eyes still fixed on the spreadsheet. She walked toward the door, her pace measured, deliberate. A nurse called out from the station, a frantic request for a chart signature, but Emily did not pause. She did not turn. She reached her hand into her pocket, felt the weight of the pager, and pulled it out. She set it on the edge of the hallway table. The plastic casing felt cold against her skin. She walked past the emergency room, ignoring the flicker of the overhead lights and the muffled sirens outside. The heavy glass doors stood ahead. She pushed them open. Air hit her face, not the sterile, filtered oxygen of the ward, but the raw, unfiltered wind of the afternoon. She stepped across the threshold, her boots hitting the pavement with a rhythmic, final thud. Every step away from the building felt like a layer of invisible armor falling away. The parking lot was empty, the horizon vast, and for the first time in years, her calendar belonged to nothing but the sun. Emily sat in her car, the engine quiet. The air inside the cabin felt still, a stark contrast to the frantic pace she had maintained for years. She pulled her phone from her bag, her thumb hovering over the banking application. She took a breath, the rhythm of her heart slow and steady against the quiet afternoon. She tapped the screen. The numbers flickered, then stabilized. 1 million. The digit stood in bold, black text against the bright white background. She stared at it, waiting for a surge of excitement, a rush of adrenaline, or the urge to buy something extravagant. None came. Instead, a wave of profound, heavy relief washed through her chest. It was not a jackpot. It was not a trophy. It was a digital barrier between her and the requirement to trade her hours for survival. She looked out the window at the hospital entrance, seeing the frantic movement of staff through the glass doors. She was no longer a part of that machine. She felt the weight of the past decade dissolve, replaced by the realization that she was finally, fundamentally cured of the obligation to exist for a paycheck. She locked the phone, set it aside, and leaned back, watching the light change across the dashboard. Emily pulled the gate shut behind her. The garden was small, enclosed by tall hedges that blocked the noise of the street. She walked to the center, where a wooden chair sat facing the western wall. She did not check her phone. She did not reach for a pager that was no longer there. The silence of the garden was absolute, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the cooling evening air. She sat down, letting her weight sink into the wood. Her hands rested flat on her knees, unmoving. She opened a book, but her eyes drifted from the page to the horizon. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of orange and violet. She watched the light crawl up the wall, changing the color of the stones minute by minute. She understood then that wealth was never about the digits she had seen on the screen. It was the authority to decide when the day began and exactly how it ended. She had no rounds to make, no patience waiting, no shift to punch. She simply sat, watching the last light fade, and for the first time in her life, the day belonged entirely to her.